Okay, so we've discussed so far how the 1890s served as a crucial decade in the history of U.S. foreign policy insofar as it marked the United States' entry onto the global stage as a major imperial power. And one particular flashpoint in this history was the Spanish-American War fought in 1898. And indeed, this is, technically speaking, the first major imperial war in our history, the first major one. And as we'll discuss in this context of overseas imperialism, it's more so the consequences of this war, the aftermath of this Spanish-American War, that interest us more than the actual war itself, okay, against the Spanish Empire. Now, at this time, you have to take note that Spain was a collapsing empire by the late 1890s. It was on its last legs. It did hold some colonies in the Caribbean, right, like Cuba, like Puerto Rico, and in the Pacific region as well. The Philippines was a major colony. They still held Guam and other smaller areas. But for the most part, this was an empire on its last legs. And should also be noted that there was such a thing as, in the United States, those imperialists who cast their gaze across the world looking for potential, American colonies, right? Because as I explained earlier, if you want to become a great country, a great nation, well, you had to pursue empire, the establishment of empire, which of course entailed annexation of overseas territory. So you had architects of American imperialism viewing these Spanish colonies, still held by the dwindling Spanish Empire, as potential acquisitions, as attractive acquisitions. And indeed, you had some commercial leaders in America as well, right, viewing these areas held by Spain as potential foreign markets for American goods. As we discussed, the state of affairs we called economic overproduction had already taken place by then, the late 1800s. Okay, so here's Spain, collapsing empire, and in Cuba at this time, there was already revolt against the Spanish rule there. You see the Cuban nationalists rising against their Spanish colonial masters, and indeed they were winning this war for independence by this time. The nationalists were controlling much of the rural area of Cuba, while the Spanish basically held on to the urban areas. And during this time, the United States proclaimed its interest to help the Cuban nationalists. Why? Because the United States, our origins as a country is anti-colonial, right? We fought against the English Empire for independence once we declared independence on July 4th, 1776. All right, so we proclaimed that we had the interest to help the Cuban nationalists, and then there was one particular event that ignited the war, that triggered the war against the Spanish Empire, and that's this illustration here in the slide. And this is a picture of what remained of the USS Maine, an American warship. So the USS Maine was an American warship that was docked on a Cuban harbor, and it exploded mysteriously one night, of course led to the death of American sailors, and the United States basically blamed Spain for this explosion. And this served as the pretext to enter war against the Spanish Empire. Okay, now, lack of time precludes a full discussion of the Spanish-American War, but just to let you know, the Spanish-American War was very quick, okay, and very one-sided victory for the United States. Now, in the Philippines during this time, well, similar to Cuba, Filipino nationalists were fighting for their independence against the Spanish colonial masters in the Philippines. And indeed, when the United States entered war against Spain, they announced their support of Philippine sovereignty because the nationalists, similar to Cubans, by the way, were already winning the war. They controlled much of the rural areas in the Philippines. Spain was relegated to the urban areas. And as the United States was waging war against the Spanish Empire, they promised to help the Philippine nationalists to fight against the Spanish colonials here. Okay, so again, it was a quick war, one-sided, and Spain, fell to its knees, and in the process, they were forced to negotiate surrender. And this was the Treaty of Paris here. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier, that it's really the aftermath of the Spanish-American War that really highlights the U.S. entry as an imperial power. Why? Because in the negotiation between the United States and Spain to come with the terms of surrender, and of course this is happening with the Treaty of Paris, Spain is forced to forfeit their colonies to the United States. Okay, and well, not all their colonies, but the main ones were Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. So these colonies fall on the lap of the United States. And the question that was before the United States was this: were they going to annex those colonies? Were they going to accept them as formal colonies of the United States? Think about the repercussions of this. Should they decide to do so, this means that the United States is now an imperial power. This means that they are now in possession of overseas colonies. Okay, so the consequences loom large here. And the significance of it does. As mentioned, the United States has anti-colonial origins as a nation. Yet, more than 100 years later, look what's happening. They are now the colonial masters, and they rule over these colonies abroad. So it's an interesting change, right, in the position of the United States, if they accept the colonies. Now, as stated in the slide here, the Philippines was actually sold as part of that negotiation, sold to the United States for $20 million. When it came to Cuba, interestingly enough, the United States decided, after some debate, after the Treaty of Paris, the United States decided to give Cuba its independence, but with strings attached, as noted there. Basically, they wanted to ensure that Cuba, as a sovereign country, a sovereign nation, provides the United States with preferential treatment, especially economically, and also with the presence. They demanded that Cuba allows the presence of U.S. military bases and installations on Cuban soil, right? And hence today we still have Guantanamo Bay in Cuba as a major American base. Okay, now what about Puerto Rico, Guam, and Puerto Rico and Guam? Well, those are going to be officially annexed after some debate. But the biggest one is really the Philippines. The Philippines aroused the most controversy at this time, okay? Likely due to the fact that it was a large area comprised of over 10 million Filipinos. And, the significance of 10 million subjects, right? Colonial subjects, now beholden to this new empire of the United States. This is something so new that, it captured the attention of many Americans back then. And needs to say it was the preoccupation of many American lawmakers and policyholders. So again, this is what falls in the lap of the United States. Should they become a colonial power, or in the spirit of anti-colonialism, which again was a principle of the United States, right? Should they just grant these colonies, former colonies of Spain, that is, independence? Okay, well, as we likely know, right, though Cuba will be given independence, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, as it would turn out, would indeed become colonial possessions of the United States, therefore turning the United States into an empire. Now, there is going to be heated debate regarding this issue. And this is what's going to preoccupy us in the next slide. The debates between what you call the imperialist versus the anti-imperialist within the United States, right? You're going to see this faction that says, no, we should not annex these colonies because, again, it goes against the grain of American principles, American ideals. And needless to say, imperialism and democracy do not mix, right? They run counter to each other ideologically. Imperialism is taking away freedom from people. But the imperialists basically will argue that if we want to become a great country, if we want to expand our influence on the world stage, then we need to officially acquire those possessions as formal colonies of the United States. So again, it's a great debate that erupts in the United States, and this is what we're going to look at with the next slide.